go past it. Welcome to stage one of the Drydock tour. We'll theoretically be down there for about an hour, maybe a little bit more. I don't think it makes too much odds. So you've all seen the safety briefing. So before we yesterday when I flew in, this was the flight path in. It was a lot quieter. So this dry dock that New Jersey's in was built in 1921, originally as part of the Navy expansion that was supposed to take the US Navy to being the biggest Navy in the world. And this specifically was built to hold the Lexington class battle cruisers, because the South Dakota class battleships were considerably shorter. They could fit in existing dry docks. The Lexington's not so much. Then the Washington Naval Treaty happened. Everything got cancelled, but of course they kept Lexington and Saratoga, and the infrastructure that was being built for that unit wasn't cancelled because it was already underway, because that takes actually longer to do a lot of the time than the ships themselves. So this dry dock was then around in time for the Second World War, and when New Jersey was built on the same slipway that USS Washington was built on, just behind us on the other side of that building, she entered this dry dock for the first time for fitting out. She then went out on her first shakedown cruise, came back in to the dry dock for a second time to fix a few issues, and then when she left she wouldn't see this dry dock again for several decades. She would enter other dry docks around the US, but she only came back to this dry dock the third time in the 60s when she was being reactivated to Vietnam, and then this is her fourth time in the dry dock because all the stuff for her decommissioning and everything was all done in separate dry docks as well. So that's briefly a quick story of the dry dock. It holds about 35 million gallons of water, give or take a little when the ship's in there displacing some. So we'll head down and go down to the end here and fetch up by the runners. Myself, Ryan and Olivia were standing on turret 3 watching the big blue rope which was sitting there pull us in. And you see this little lone block down here? That's not a mistake. There's another similar one like it, just forward of the ship at the other end. And when we're towards the end of the tour down in the dry dock, I'll tell you what those two blocks are for. But it's a devastatingly simple way of making sure the ship is very accurately placed. But as we go down, apparently you're supposed to hold these underneath, so then if you do have to, don't have to go 150 steps down, you'll just to hold on to it very easily. do that, you will abandon that gun. Or just try not to sort of fall down the stairs, so helps. The one on the left is slightly less burning than the one on the right. Propellers on whilst the museum ships are stationary, like New Jersey, especially a ship on the scale of New Jersey, is that these are on the end of some very, very long metal shafts, which means that they are trying to bend the prop shafts, and the prop shafts are then pointing in the middle. On the ship, if it was in active service, this wouldn't be a problem because the propellers would be spinning, so it would be evenly distributing that force, roughly speaking, at the time. But the ship spent 30 years with the propeller stationary, there was a potential that that might actually bend the prop shafts enough to ruin any chance of having to land and keeping the ship warm. The fact that the propellers are still on means that they can. So that's four blades on the 5 blades on the inner props, and the other side they're actually in opposition. So the left hand prop will rotate one way, right hand prop turn the other way, and that means there's no torque inherent to the ship's propulsion that might cause it to wander port or starboard. The number of blades is essentially a trade-off between more blades, you have more surface area, and technically that delivers you more power, but the trailers off the blade is then closer to the next one, which means that more blades is less efficient, so 2 or 3 blades is more efficient. Your outer props, which would be better for cruising, and your inner props would be better for just motoring at the same time. The other very useful thing is that, as they discovered with North Carolina and Washington, have a long tunnel the inner two props on the skegs, you can end up with a lot of resonance. And one of the ways of disrupting that is to have differential numbers of blades on the various propellers, which was one of the solutions they eventually arrived at, but with Washington and North Carolina. Fortunately, the Irish didn't suffer from that too much, but they did suffer from some vibration on the inner prop shafts, which is probably to do with the Holland Tunnel, which we'll go down in a second. But before we do that, these are obviously the rudders. These are hollow. There's nothing in them. There is a little bit of framing there. Some framing to keep them rigid. But these are to be pressure tested to see if they're still watertight. Each of these is semi-balanced, so that's basically the ideal for battleship control. You don't want them fully balanced, otherwise it would be almost impossible to turn the ship. You don't want them completely unbalanced, because otherwise it's going to go everywhere. So semi-balanced rudders are really the way to go. And each of these can be run independently of the other. So if one of them stops working for whatever reason, you can still operate the other one perfectly fine. The two control systems are completely separate from each other. And of course that also means you can do the famous barn door stop. And you've probably heard of that, where you turn this propeller in and that propeller in, creating a massive wall and acts as a massive brake, which when they did it on Wisconsin, which is the only iron class which verifiably tried it, theoretically can bring the ship to a stop inside its own length, which could be very useful for, if you're about to ram something, as effectively a dead stop. However, shockingly, Wisconsin suffered from loose rudders after that. I wonder why. So, does anyone have any questions about this stern area room before we head into the Holland Tunnel, or wants to take a distant shot?
You said the propellers were bending the propeller shafts. Is that the weight of the propellers themselves, or is that the torque on the...
It's the weight of the propellers. So as I say, if they're spinning most of the time, that is going to get distributed, and if they sit stationary for a bit, it's fine, it will even out. But 30 years of constant bending is a little bit of a problem. One of the reasons, not the only one of the reasons they've been painted black, is because, of course, if you have two different metals, then you can get galvanic action and therefore corrosion, and that can actually happen even between different grades of steel. But manganese, bronze, and steel, that's a huge invitation for galvanic action. So by painting it, is actually reducing the amount, the risk of that happening.
What are those attachments for up there?
The pad eyes. Ryan, sorry. The pad eyes up here. That's the pointer down here. I don't know what.
They are permanent attachments, or if we have to drop a propeller or rudder, they're just constantly in place for if we need to take one off, put a new one on. We might be doing this at a floating dry dock forward deployed that doesn't have all the facilities that a yard like this has. Move down the Holland Tunnel so we can clear the way for the next one.
So this is the and I was just speaking to one of the other guys who works here. One of the fairly decent theory as to why the inner prop shaft suffered from vibration is because the tunnel is narrowing down as we get closer to the here. I'm going to switch over to clear glasses I can see. One of the theories is that as the water comes up into here, obviously you have a gradually widening mouth. So at this point, and that may act like a venturi nozzle. So, small amount of water, much bigger surface area, that water therefore accelerates, which would mean that the body of water coming down the Holland Tunnel would be moving faster than the body of water outside of it, which means that these two inner props would have more force being exerted on them when the blades are on this side of the skate than when they're on the outside, which of course is then trying to twist the props out that way, which you can take them off the true, which is then going to lead to potentially the vibration effects that they reported. Here, these were inspection covers, so that you could go into the skeds and make sure that the prop shafts were properly aligned, the joints were in place. They've been taken off because obviously they're water intrusion hazards and they've been plated over, but that can be undone if necessary. And we've got some of the first of the new aluminium anodes, or aluminum I suppose I should say, anodes which are part of the new anti-corrosion system. One of the things you'll notice as we go along is the ship is a mixture of riveted and welded. So you can see a lot of down here in the bottom, there's much more riveting. If you look up on the superstructure, it's vastly majority welding, and that's because essentially welding, although the US was a leader in welding in the 1940s, it was still a relatively unproven technology on the scale of the battleship, and so welding compared to riveting, although it makes the ship lighter, it does also make it more rigid and therefore more prone to things going snap than while things going bend. And so when you're working on the lower portion of the ship, you want weight lower down so the ship remains stable. And also this is the part that's going to potentially be smacking into things, so you don't want it breaking, you want it bending, hence more riveting than welding. Like these patches here are much more recent. So you keep moving down, you'll see obviously that over time there has been a lot of pitting and corrosion on the outer plating. And the plating all in here is of all sorts of different thicknesses. It's a very confusing mess of it, but part of the reason, not entirely, but part of the reason is that although these ships exceed the 35,000 ton limit of the Washington and later London Naval treaties, they are actually still technically treating limited ships because the escalator clause that was invoked escalated gun caliber from 14 inches in London 2 to 16, that's the 1650s, but also escalated displacement from 35 to 45,000 tons, so the designers were still making a good faith effort to keep within that 45,000 ton limit, and part of that is, well, if you don't need 1.5 thick steel in certain places, cut it down to 1 inch or 3/4 of an inch, and that might not make a huge amount of difference per plate, but over the vast area of the underwater hull, it does actually add up to quite a few tons. And of course, every ton you save on that is a ton you can put to something else, like armour or guns, or more guns. So this is the only place on the ship where the keel comes out of the ship. So this is actually the ship's keel itself, the central spine of the vessel, and it extends out essentially to provide a place for it to be dry docked, because otherwise there wouldn't be enough support. These two skegs are also the docking keels. So there are 5 keels on the ship. The central keel, 2 docking keels, and then 2 bilge keels, which are further out. And bilge keels, you do not want to, they're not for dry docking at all. They are hollow, really thin. They're purely there to make the ship more stable and slow her roll period down, which makes her a better gun platform. And because they're hollow, you put any kind of weight on them, they will bend and crumple like a cheap tin can. And when we head out that way, you'll see that they have, because they're the first bit of the ship that runs into stuff like sandbanks and submarines and anything else that's in the area. Also in this area, you can see little boxes here, and there's just over 160 of these. These are would have been originally of various descriptions. Most of them are associated with letting single trips called machinery, but of course with the ship being stationary, those aren't needed anymore, so the machinery's not running. So because they're potential points for them to get in and ruin things, you have these boxes were put on spot welded in place, well, line welded in place, and one of the tasks when the ship's been in here in dry dock is actually to inspect every one of these with an air compressor to see if they're still airtight. If they're airtight, they're watertight. If they're not, then you need to work out where that leak is. If it's on the outside, you spray it down with soapy water and look for bubbles, and then you can re-weld it. And if it's not airtight, but the outside seems to be fine, that means one of the 2 valves inside has gone. And the valves inside of them, that's not brilliant. You might notice that also each of them have got 2 of these little eye-looking things on them. That's because one, the slightly bigger one, that's the original Navy inspection point. But after 30 years in the water, those are all corroded to be useless. So the second one is the one that they had to do here to run those tests. So you'll see this, they've all been numbered, you'll see that the ship, but mostly around the half of the ship's over. That's an inspection. The plate has been welded into place in some way.
How thick is this plating now?
It varies. Literally, each line of plate will be of different thicknesses. Everything from 3/4 inch to 1.5 and a little bit above, a little bit below, a little bit in between. It's a little bit of a nightmare. But if firework had been designed without limits at all, like say the Montana's were, it almost certainly would have been uniform thickness. There may have been small areas where it was made thinner for structural reasons or to save weight when it was completely unnecessary, but it would have been a far less complex operation than the island. And that's one of the other things they've had to do is obviously use ultrasound to check the thickness of the plates, because however thick they were when they were built, they may not be that thick now. And if they've gone too thin, then you have to start worrying. So we're going to head out through this way, duck under the stick. All right, so I mentioned the nature of the issue of So, now, this is why I chose the starboard side, because this is nice and cool.
Appreciate it.
Now, if you look along, you'll see all these little circular ports that have been re-welded shut. Those are not original features. Those were done in the 80s when the Navy converted the ship from bunker C to the current Navy propulsion fuel, which this effectively is diesel fuel, but with the serial numbers filed off. The problem is that the ship, when it's in reserve with the Navy, has to have a certain amount of fuel in it to help ballast the ship down. And you can imagine what bunker C turns into after 15, 20 years sitting idle. So in order to clean everything out and protect it, everywhere you see one of these, that's the tank. So I'm kind of send this line with a high pressure steam line into rinse it all out, and then just put the plate below again. So it's not an original World War II feature, but it is an original to the Navy feature, as opposed to a conservation feature. This is obviously one of those bigger black planes, and it's similar to those the tie points on there. These are for chain points. So you've got change the D-rings on the outside, so you can run the change across to the ones on the inside and lower that up and down without having to bring in heavy machinery.
Now, is the pitting part of the erosion that's been occurring, or?
Yes. So there's two elements to that. One is naturally, obviously, as the underwater coating wears away, you will end up with some rust. The other element is actually that back in when the ship was being brought back into service, which is unique to New Jersey, they were supposed to have an internal electronic anti-corrosion system. The ship was fitted for it, but not with it, because they stuck a bunch of anodes in the outside. Obviously, zinc ones, the new ones are aluminium. The zinc is the best one for salt water, aluminium is for brackish, magnesium is for pure fresh water. Except some absolute genius painted over everything before they applied the anodes, so there was no conductivity between the hull and them, which of course meant they were just useless dead weight, which meant the steel started going, oh well, I would like, induced electrical current and everything, I would like to travel to the lovely magnesium bronze propellers, but as the current went that way, so did bits of the steel and hence all the pitting. So when they realised that, the other three got that internal system straight off the bat, because, well, that was a problem for New Jersey, but then they had to give New Jersey the same system as well. But unfortunately it now means the outside looks like a bit like the moon.
The inner armor belt, how is that made? How big of pieces of steel were brought in? Were they welded together, or how are they? I mean, it's not all one piece, right?
They are actually bolted to the internal structure. So if you're in places like the aft mess, you can actually see these massive great bolts coming through the inner skin of the hull, and each of the armour plates would have multiple bolts fitted to the back where it was softer, and they're bolted onto the hull. You don't want to joint the armour plates together, because if the ship takes a hit and the armour plate is damaged, you want to be able to, if it's still there at all, to just unbolt it and replace it with a new section. Whereas if they're obviously flush, but if they're physically joined together, then damage would spread pointlessly through multiple plates.
How big is each plate?
It varies depending on where it is in the ship, because obviously they're all angled, but as you get closer to the bow and stern, the hull itself starts to curve, which means you start to get more and more complex shapes, so those plates have to be smaller. If I remember correctly from the last time I was down in the void, along the main run, you're talking like 10, 20 feet square. They're very large, heavy units. There's pictures from various navies. I haven't present pictures of them installing an Isle class's plates, but it's all much of a muchness because there's only so much how large you can actually make a physical plate. Shapes vary as well, but one of the advantages the Isle has had is along most of the run, it can just be a nice straight run of inclined slabs, essentially, whereas an externally belted ship has to conform to the whole way along, which tends to mean you end up with smaller plates because of that. The complexity. Everyone's different. Yeah, and it also actually makes it easier for maintenance if the ship was hit, because if let's say 80% of the plates are just an inclined square or rectangular slab, they're pretty much interchangeable to a degree, whereas if you're looking at a classic elliptically shaped ship where the armour is conforming to the shape of the hull the whole way along, that's probably the only place on the hull where that particular armour plate will fit. So if that gets damaged, you have to remake that particular plate. And just hope you kept a lot of good drawings.
When you took the ship out of the water, did you notice any cavitation pitting on the screws themselves? Because you see all the regular corrosion pitting around on the underhull. But on the screws, were they also pitted up from cavitation during its in-service period, or did you have to do anything special back there?
No, we didn't notice anything like that. We had some documentation that says that they did some sort of weld repair on some of the ones that were lightly damaged, and they completely swapped
Some of the blades.
some of the entire propellers for some of them that weren't in good shape. But since we haven't rotated these, we didn't see any damage except one nick on one blade that was not there when the ship was decommissioned. So we're not sure what caused that.
Very angry fish.
Yeah, Delaware River piranha. Yeah.
So just going to move on and look along a little bit.
We do have what I think is cavitation damage to the bow of the ship.
So this is a little bit of a better view of some of the new aluminium anodes. You can see they've all been bolted on. Now, if you see the zinc anodes that they've got, which are the old ones that got taken off, that were for sale back when we started, these are twice as thick because it turns out apparently the metal is cheap, it's more expensive there. So it was a case of, well, if you get one with the same thickness as the old one, but twice as thick as the old one, it will cost the same. So twice as thick than half as many. So these runs are shorter than the ones that the zinc anodes were taken off, but they're taken more suited for the water also, you can see, so this is one of the bilge kits, and you can see how easily they've got bent. These used to be for stiffness filled with balsa and fine tar, balsa pulp. They're not anymore. So when the Navy came to fix these were in a lot worse shape before, and as we get further along, you'll see more and more the edges are welded rather than riveted, because they were originally riveted. Anywhere there's welding, that's where the Navy looked at them and went, well, this is fine. As you can see, this is actually still a riveted section, or at least at this end. So the Navy clearly looked at this and gone, that's fine. Imagine how bad it had to be for the Navy to go, this is not fine, and carve it off and replace it with a welded section.
Just bet it's still there.
But it seems to have basically the filler probably rotted out at some point, and then when it's all been bashed and holes have opened up, it's all just washed out. But they're now hollow. Just going to pause here because this is actually a really good point of further looking at. You can see just here we've got the long welded bit that's underneath the replacement, followed by the riveting bit. But you might notice another thing, which is if you look at some of the rivets up there, you can see they're nice and smooth. You look at the rivets down here, and they look a little bit like a cinnamon roll. That's because these aren't these. They look like rivets, but they're not rivets. They're actually welds that have been stuck over the rivet holes.